On jealousy. When I was 8 years old, I watched the Disney animated film Mulan at home on a VHS tape. Mulan was such an infectiously impressive character to me, a warrior woman who exuded honor and valor, qualities that I had typically encountered only in male heroes. I remember feeling my heart beat afterwards and an irresistible urge to copy. Finding the remote control in my hand and tossing away the banal thing with some distaste, would Mulan have time to watch rented VHS films? I switched off the TV and went to take a photograph of myself. So here's that photo. Becoming known to oneself through character. How is a child, comparatively untrained in managing her own impressionability to character, supposed to contain the effects of such a film? Perhaps adults are accustomed to such aesthetic gestures as women cutting their hair with their father's sword or taking his place in battle. But children are not. At some point, this gesture must be dealt for the first time, with the impressiveness of the sword's blow, taken to cut the fine black lines of a daughter's femininity. Would I do the same for my father, had he too been unwell and conscripted to join the army? Would I too make that sacrifice with the same fearless determination? These are questions of character. Would I? It is not always easy to say what one would do in hypothetical or unprecedented situations awaiting us in the future. That is why we have the phrase, "I'll see what I'll do," conserved for those cases in which one does not yet know what one's response will be, but has a good sense that they will miraculously find out when the time finally comes. When that time comes, and when that response is enacted, it will appear to reflect on one's character overall, as if in those split-second moments, one is revealed to oneself. The film had equipped me that afternoon with the imagination to first become conscious of, and then further dwell on, the hypothetical situation of choosing whether or not to take my father's place in battle. It provided even a mental platform from which to rehearse my response, preparing me for it, so that the fictional character Mulan had already begun to affect the outcome of this possible eventuality. There must have been many occasions like this one, in which the dissatisfaction of staying still, staying as I was, had filled me to the brim and urged me to shift something deep about myself. Moreover, this deep shift could begin to be enacted by relatively superficial adjustments, moving into another room, wielding a fatal prop, or staring into the camera with a look approaching an oath. The camera, as opposed, for example, to a mirror, was just the right audience for this sort of shift. Instead of looking at the mirror and seeing oneself reflected in the present, the camera is a future-oriented thing, a prop for becoming. Staring into the vortex of its lens, the performer stages herself for the future, stages the version of herself she will become. Mulan had looked at me like that while I was watching the film, as if I had been the camera lens. Now I too had entered the world of images and looked back at the lens with a grain of contempt, as if on the other side of it sat the cowardly girl I had left behind. Jealousy as orientation towards the other. Jealousy, in the sense that I will use it in this thesis, is a concept that comes directly out of my artistic practice. I began using the word very early on, before I started out at art school, to explain to myself what I felt was happening in my character performances, and why I was so motivated to make them in the first place. I use it to refer to the emotional state I found myself in before imitating Mulan as a child, a particular kind of emotional positioning towards another that also turns out to be key to my performance practice. While it might not necessarily be applicable to all practice, for me it has usefully served as a relational concept for thinking about authorship, influence, and curiosity in the other. For this reason, the term jealousy will come up every now and again in this dissertation, particularly when I'm discussing the beginning of my performance process and how characters come to me in the first place. My use of the term jealousy diverges somewhat from both colloquial uses and dictionary definitions, most conspicuously perhaps in the way I describe it as playing a positive, generative and liberating role in my practice, when more conventional cases of jealousy can trigger a sense of personal inadequacy, as well as outward-facing negative emotions such as hostility, bitterness or resentment directed towards the other of whom one is jealous. Despite these divergent experiences of jealousy and its effects on self-worth and regard of the other of whom one is jealous, using the word jealousy in my practice is accurate because it hinges on the same initial feeling, the sudden sense upon encountering another of wanting something that they have. But the jealousy I experience as an artist is not burdened by any resentment for the other that possesses it, or the wish that they should have to lose their admirable quality or possession as I gain it. On the contrary, it is an emotion characterized by an admiration of the difference of others. It is, to call back to the story at the beginning of this section, the feeling I get when I'm stopped in my tracks by someone else's character, be they fictitious like Mulan or real like a friend, and filled with a sense of wonder and longing to know what it must be like to be somebody like that. For me, performance is a venture to answer the curiosity in the other that jealousy stirs in me. In my search for a term that might more accurately describe my emotional state preceding a performance, I've so far found alternatives to jealousy to be inadequate. For instance, although envy is said to sometimes be mistaken for jealousy, the emphasis on the value of audience perception, how one is seen in the eyes of others, in jealousy, makes it a more relevant concept for my performance practice, since in my work I'm querying the difference that changing character makes to who I become. Because character must be read in order to be recognized as such, the audience must always be taken into account in any question of who I am becoming when I change character. Another potential alternative to jealousy that has been suggested to me is desire, placing the emphasis on the wanting or longing itself involved in wanting what someone else has. In particular, the sense of wanting to overcome a lack of something and achieve the aspired gratification that filling the void is often hoped to bring. Working in favor of this term, desire, is the fact that it is already used in some discourses on art practice. Yet jealousy is still preferred over desire for two reasons. Firstly, desire implies a metaphorical or literal drive towards consumption, or even subsumption, of the object of desire, reflected in references made to eating and satiation in discourses on desire. The experience of jealousy, however, preserves the autonomy of the other. That which one wants, as well as they who already possess it, remain outside of oneself. Even in the event that one finally gets what one wants and becomes more like that of which they were once jealous. When Mulan's character impresses me, I do not wish to consume or subsume her character in order to fill a Mulan-shaped void within me. I wish to be more like her and copy her. Jealousy's aspiration for likeness over desire's consumption implies a relationship to the other characterized by duplication over consummation. The cake I desire gets eaten and becomes one with me, but the character of which I am jealous remains external to me, even as I imitate it. Secondly, desire seems to connote a more durational form of wanting than jealousy, whereas the latter is sometimes described as coming in short, sharp doses, as in the phrase, a pang of jealousy. The character jealousy that motivates my performances is temporary and piercing, often surprising when it comes, and the period for which I wish to have what the other has is not lasting. This is another sense in which my use of the term jealousy diverges from conventional uses. I do not aspire to permanently acquire the characteristic of which I am jealous, and when a performance ends, I find that I can comfortably come back to my habitual way of presenting. This defined temporality gives contours to my performance practice, enabling it to become an experimental field in which I can isolate the various nuanced effects of shifting character on my authorship. For these reasons, and in spite of some of the potential negative connotations of the term, jealousy remains the most accurate English word I can think of to communicate the emotional state preceding the moments of character contagion, so instrumental to my practice, as when Mulan infected me with her character. Further, some of the hard edges of jealousy can be softened when we recall that, in everyday contemporary usage, the theatrical expression of jealousy can even serve as a compliment and expression of admiration. Like, I love your shoes, I'm so jealous, you know. Thus, in this practice, jealousy manifests not as the disgruntled regret of one who thinks of what she lacks. It is rather a positive, appreciative gesture towards something out there, an orientation towards ways of being that are otherwise. Implied within this concept of jealousy is empathy. When I see an enviable characteristic in someone else, it is already playing out to some extent in me. Where jealousy comes to me as a pang, an emotional experience orienting me towards the other, empathy is a skill, turning the dance between self and other into a practice. Empathy is the next step in entertaining one's character jealousy, which is why I call my performance video series the One Woman Empathy Circus. So far, exploring how jealousy is defined in my practice has raised several related concepts, such as character contagion, copying, and empathy. All of these will be elaborated on below, along with a closer look at how they come together in my performance practice. For now, it is only necessary to note that jealousy, as it is understood in this practice, is about the back and forth interplay between self and other, present in the shifting foundations of a soul in movement. Jealousy as a gateway to becoming other. While copying for its own sake has sometimes been deemed an embarrassment to contemporary art, which seeks the new, the original, the avant-garde, it seems to be the very thing that thrills so many artists into the state of practicing in the first place, in the same way it thrills children watching films with strong characters. Perhaps one of the motivations for art practice and the copying it entails is the attractive possibility of becoming something else, of shape-shifting into something new through the work that is not necessarily coming from the artist alone, but comes from the world outside to merge with and reshape them. Perhaps the practice lends the artist an escape route from themselves, as when T.S. Eliot writes, "Poetry is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality." The comparative images above of me performing as Mulan serve to highlight the function of jealousy in my performance practice in a number of ways. One of these is the idea that there is a link between jealousy and becoming. Feeling the kind of admiring jealousy as I felt for Mulan, or any character that does not seem to belong to one's own repertoire of expression, an interesting acquaintance or striking celebrity, for instance, can quickly give way to an empathetic effect. This empathetic effect entails temporarily feeling oneself becoming or assimilating oneself to that other character, as in this description by Alfred Gell of his experience of looking at a painting by Vermeer. Gazing at the picture, my jaw drops in admiration and defeat. This defeat is, however, profitable to me also, to the extent that in mentally retracing Vermeer's origination of his picture, the technical and imaginative performance which culminated in the finished work, I do manage, exercising such powers as I possess, to attain a certain point before I break off in bewilderment and can follow Vermeer no longer through the maze of his artistic agency. Up to a point, I can be Vermeer. I can identify with his artistic procedure and see his picture vicariously as a product of my bodily engagement with the world and with the materials artists manipulate. I do want to point out, sorry, before I move on, most of these footnotes I'm skipping because you can read them, but footnote number 96 here, I have been using every now and again the term expression. I said it here, so feeling the kind of admiring jealousy as I felt for Mulan or any other character that does not seem to belong to one's own repertoire of expression, so you expressing yourself. Okay, so what exactly I mean by that is, throughout this research, my use of the word expression follows Erving Goffman's sociological definition and is referred to in terms of the communicative role it plays during social interaction rather than the essential release of some truer self within. So just so you know, when I'm saying a person is being expressive or has a repertoire of expression, that's not to say that they have some kind of essential self within themselves that is coming out, that is being pressed out, expressed. But I mean it more as the way we would use the word expression as a synonym for a phrase. So it's a kind of a pattern of behavior that you're putting out there. So whenever I'm saying an expression, I just mean an outward behavior, a social behavior. This link between perceiving another agent carrying out an action, or its results in the case of the painting by Vermeer, and identifying with the action, perceived as though it had been carried out by oneself, has been supported by mirror neuron theory. A mirror neuron is a kind of neuron, a brain cell, that will fire in my brain when I do something, such as lift a heavy object. But it will also fire when I see another person lifting a heavy object. In this way, the mirror neuron system in our brains appears to code, quote, agent-independent actions, and form a certain degree of equivalence of experience from the point of view of the perceiver, but regardless of whether they or somebody else is doing the action, they are perceiving. This phenomenon could be extended to countless other examples, and art often takes advantage of it. When watching characters in a romantic scene in a film, for example, as viewers we might also feel romantic emotions, or as though we too are in love. This is why mirror neurons have become key to research on empathy. And this is a quote from Udin et al. From The Self and Social Cognition. It has been proposed that these neurons can provide a link between self and other, enabling intersubjectivity through an intentional attunement mechanism that enables the understanding of the actions and associated mental states of others through the unreflective automatic simulation of the actions and associated mental states of the self. Mirror neurons enable the way in which others do things, their character, to infiltrate us through perception alone, since they fire in response to what we perceive. This creates an internal simulation of what the other is doing, so that it feels as if it were ourselves who were doing it. Jealousy is here being proposed as a highly attentive and interested form of this empathetic perception, and it can tip one out of the state of perception alone into action, into imitation. Mulan's own martial training in the film had consisted of imitation, in repeating the military drills and combat choreographies over and over. Her clumsiness is eventually straightened out and replaced by deft virtuosity. Whatever moral kinks existed in my resolution to replace my father in battle someday could be ironed out through practice, I thought, through a keen study of the occasion and the character I would need to have in order to rise to it. Perhaps my efforts were not wasted. I was, after all, rehearsing and gaining in some sort of imaginative brand of life experience, the kind that is appended to our personal life experiences by the stories of others. Mulan's character had become for me a training ground for rehearsing courage. Copying in art. When I ask artists about how they started being artists, it often begins with a story about copying. They were maybe copying something as in life drawing, or maybe they were tracing over an admired artist's work. Originality often starts with copying because being an individual starts with the communal. One of many ways of describing what an artist is someone who deals in character. Not just people-like characters, but also thing-like characters. A bush has character. A Pokemon has character. A voice has character. Characters are meaningful cultural patterns, and as artists, we become very attuned to them, tracing them, copying them, repurposing them, deploying them to our various private investigations. In my practice, I write novels, I pretend to be different people, I draw Pokemon, I sing in the shower, and I dance to hip-hop music videos. In other words, I expose myself as much as possible to character. I grow pleasantly jealous of these characters. I inhabit them willingly or unwillingly. I allow myself to become infected, to become under the influence of character, to become a vehicle for character to manifest and disappear. I get to know characters. I form relationships with them, which also means forming relationships with myself. Copying, pretending, role-playing, imitating, gesturing, insinuating, delineating, these are things any artist can do with a brush, with a camera, with a pencil, with their bodies, with whatever actions are dear to them, and it allows them a way into the characters, the meaningful patterns that flow like currency in our shared world. Character allows artists to empirically touch and prod the world in intimate ways. Jealousy at work in the performance practice. Performing made me realize how easily affected I was by external character, how I seemed to be carrying with me an unexplored bandwidth of alterity all the time. The performances turned out to be an organized staging of the kind of imitation I produced of Mulan as a child, only now I was often discovering the sources of my character jealousies in retrospect. Each performed character betrayed multiple lineages, amongst likely many more which I will never succeed in tracing. characteristics from different sources combined into one hybrid character. One of them, for example, was a concoction forged out of, at least, Coco Chanel, my aunt, Slavoj Žižek, and Catwoman's Kitka disguise. My urge to practice in this way seemed to stem from a longing to inhabit, just for a moment, some quality that I admired or envied. Such a jealousy as this is not a bitter or resentful jealousy, but rather a discontented kind of admiration, a motivating jealousy. Nor must the object of this jealousy resemble a person. Here are some examples. I am jealous of the tender line in Winsor McKay's Little Nemo. I am jealous of how much humanity seems to fit into a single movement in a Pina Bausch choreography. I am jealous of the delightful vivacity of the bush outside my window. I am jealous of my friend Aiste, who effortlessly sheds expressive gestures and glances that are a treat to notice. I am jealous of Amélie Poulain's appreciation of mundane events, and I am jealous of that French aesthetic that surrounds her, and which I was not born into. I am jealous of the rigour of the scientific method, where this thesis is an experiment in importing some of its characteristics into artistic practice. The fact that I am jealous of all these characters does not mean that I would prefer to swap places with them, but that I would, without sacrificing my own history and condition, desire to temporarily avail myself of a power I have not deserved.